Lillian. I love being at these meetings, first and foremost because of the incredible energy of Lillian and Paul and their goodwill and their vision that we all benefit from. But the other reason why I love these meetings is because the number one word that comes to my mind in describing this group is humanity. I travel to a lot of different professional meetings. I would not use that word to describe any of the other meetings that I go to. There's just something really unique about the group here that in all of our different ways, the different things that we do, I think what brings us together is kind of a deep sense of humanity. Okay, so I'm talking today about forces against and for eudaimonia. And before I go into that, for those of you who don't know much about my work, there's just a few things I say at the beginning here. So about 30 years ago, I published an article in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology entitled "Happiness is Everything, or Is It? Explorations on the Meaning of Psychological Well-Being." And in that article, I basically advocated for a new conceptual and empirical approach to the study of psychological well-being. And why did I do that? Well, it was because when I was in graduate school, I was trained in lifespan developmental psychology, social gerontology, and everybody at that time was studying life satisfaction or happiness. Life satisfaction was described at the time as the most frequently studied variable in the field of social gerontology. And I found it wanting. I found it wanting on grounds of where did it come from conceptually, where did it come from theoretically, philosophically. When you scratch beneath the surface, there wasn't a lot there. Meanwhile, as an undergraduate, I don't know if you can read the small print under the circle here, but as an undergraduate, I read a lot of existential, humanistic, clinical, and developmental psychology. All of these formulations were aiming to describe the upside of the human condition. And I loved that work, but I realized that that work had almost no presence in the empirical arena. And the reason it had no presence was because no one had developed tools to try to operationalize some of these concepts coming out of these rich theories about the upside of human experience. So the 6 components in the model, the hand represents reaching for something new, and the 6 components are there. I'm not going to go through and define all of them. We've been talking about some of them here. They each represent points of convergence in all of this stuff that is below the circle. So really what I was trying to do was pull together what so many of these other people had written about and distill them down to something that we could actually try to measure. And I put at the base of all of this Aristotle's eudaimonia, which we've had some discussion about at the meeting here. Reading the Nicomachean Ethics was really pivotal in my intellectual journey because it starts out with the big question: what is the highest of all human goods? And Aristotle answered that it's happiness, but he said people don't agree about what is meant by happiness. And he defined happiness as activity of the soul in accord with virtue. And then he pushed himself to articulate what is the highest of all human virtues. And that's where eudaimonia comes to the fore. It is about the realization of your unique talent and potential. It is about a kind of personal excellence. And I love those ideas. I'm sure I love those ideas because I thought naturally as a developmentalist. So we develop structured self-report scales to measure these things. And 25 years later, to my surprise, I wrote a review about the fact that these scales at that point had been translated into more than 30 languages, and over 500 publications had been generated. And I was curious about, well, what are these people doing with these scales? And so I wrote this review and basically summarized, these were the main topic areas covered in the literature that was being generated with these scales of well-being. Many people focused on their psychometric properties. Was it really a 6-factor model? Many people focused on how do these aspects of well-being change as people age across adult life? What are their correlates with personality? How do they relate to work and family life? I became very interested in how these aspects of well-being matter for health and how they connect with physiological systems in the body. And then there was a bunch of studies looking at these components of well-being in intervention or clinical studies. This past year, I was asked to write an article for a special issue of this journal devoted to highly cited studies. And the assignment for the people who were asked to write articles in this special issue was to say, what was the work about? But then to reflect on, why do you think it's had so much impact? And I love that question. I really love being forced to think about that question. So at this point, there are over 750 publications using these scales of well-being. All kinds of people all over the world use them. They're now in 35 different languages. And when I ask myself, why has there been so much interest in this area? Why all the interest? I believe it stems from the fact that the model here is about intellectually vital ideas and ideals. They are reaching for essential meanings of what constitutes the best within us as distilled from these nourishing well springs. So it's nothing about Carol Ryff. It is about all of the sources that I drew on to basically try to pull together this new conception of what well-being is. I think that's part of the reason. I think people resonate to something that they see as vital, as a formulation of human well-being. But there is also a lot of versatility and relevance in the scales, in which I have already illustrated. People can use them to study what's happening with adult development as people move across the life course. I love the fact that so many people have brought these scales into the context of people's lives. So we know a lot about how work and family life matters for these aspects of well-being. I'm very interested in the nexus with health and biology, not because I think biomarkers, biomarkers are the be-all and end-all. I don't, but I do believe that when we start linking subjective phenomenological experience to biological systems, to what's going on in the brain, in the physiology, and even in genetics, in gene expression, we have stepped into an entirely different realm in which we are basically saying this fuzzy, subjective stuff actually really matters. It really matters because it contours the biology and the physiology. And of course it's happening in the brain, but we're learning something about where it's happening in the brain. Another reason why I think these scales have had so much impact is because they embrace integrative science, as exemplified by the MIDUS study. The MIDUS study, MIDUS stands for Midlife in the US. And it was a study begun in 1995 with about 7,000 Americans aged 25 to 74. We now have over 12,000 people in the study, many of whom have been followed for more than 20 years. And the key point, the key purpose of this study is to advance knowledge of factors that promote positive health and human resilience. The MIDUS study is really multidisciplinary. I will come back to this theme again and again, but we brought together experts from many different fields and disciplines. This is just a picture of the content. It's on our website. I'm not going to go through it. This is the homepage on the website. The MIDUS data are publicly available. MIDUS has become an exercise in democratizing science. Anybody can work with these data without any permissions, and we now have 53,000 unique users of the data. Some people are actually using the data to teach methods classes or substantive classes because the data are so well documented and they're really user-friendly. So the website is worth visiting if you don't know anything about the study. We now have over 1,000 publications from MIDUS, and this table is on the website. If you click on publications, without the numbers because they're always changing, but if you click on any one of these headings, you are taken to PDFs of all of those papers. So this is a really information-rich website, and I would just note that we have about 200 publications on the topic of psychological well-being, not just about my measures. We have very good measures of positive and negative affect and life satisfaction and daily assessments of many of those things. And I also want to draw attention to the fact, among these other things, one that I'm going to be making noise about here today is the work going on in the study under the heading of social inequalities. So this brings me to the new directions. In previous talks, I would have gone from that point into telling you what are all the latest findings that have come out about these scales of well-being. I'm tired of giving that talk because, not because I don't think what can be said there is interesting, but because I think there are really more important things that we need to be talking about. And I've decided I'm using the platform I have at this phase in my career to really draw attention to what I think are kind of dystopian topics, difficult topics, but topics that I think we absolutely need to talk about. So this is the part about what's working against eudaimonia of many people, what I think may be promoting eudaimonia in many people, but we haven't studied it very well. And I would just note these two publications where I've started developing these ideas, and I'm happy to send these papers to anybody. You'll have my email at the end here. I believe it's really important to anchor the science that we do in the historical context. And there are many things that have come up about at this meeting about, what concerns us in the current historical context. But one thing that concerns me deeply is the widening of inequalities. Inequalities in income, inequalities in life opportunities, inequalities in educational attainment. This book was published in 2017 by an economist at Brookings called Dream Hoarders, How the American Upper Middle Class is Leaving Everyone Else in the Dust, Why That is a Problem and What to Do About It. So this is an amazing book that underscores the growing class divide in America. It's worse in America than in other European countries, even though inequality is a worldwide phenomenon. But in the US, and we're talking the top 20% here, it's not the top 2%. They have privileged access to better education, better jobs, stable marriages, to equally or more successful partners. They live in safe and thriving neighborhoods. They have higher income, more wealth, healthier lifestyles, and longer lifespans. And Carol Graham, who is also an economist at Brookings, in the same year published this book, Happiness for All, Unequal Hopes and Lives in Pursuit of the American Dream. She's become a real expert on subjective well-being in different segments of American society. This is all population-based research, but she's showing basically that these preceding discrepancies in life opportunities and income and education, they translate to compromised levels of optimism, life satisfaction, and happiness among those who are disadvantaged. And then I'm going to bring in some contemporary news from the New York Times. So in the US, today, if you looked at the Times, you would have been reading about, oh, how fabulous it is that, you know, we have really brought in so many people back into full employment in America. And we hear from the current administration how wonderful the economy is doing. Well, the thing that those political announcements leave out is this problem that paychecks are lagging among wage workers in the US as corporate profits are soaring. Prices are eroding wage gains, and this article was just last month. The top line shows employee pay as a share of national income across time. The bottom line shows corporate profits as a share of national income across time. So the point here is, for some people, the American economy is working spectacularly well, but it's certainly not for wage earners. And it's even worse than that. So in February of this past year, this article came out in the Times about corporate America is suppressing the wages of many workers. And there's actually a technical term for this called monopsony power. Despite the economic recovery and steady job growth, wages for most Americans have hardly budged. The culprit is monopsony power, which is the ability of employers to suppress wages below the efficient or perfectly competitive level of compensation. Workers accept low wages and substandard conditions because they have few alternatives and because employers control them through contract terms. I believe monopsony power is a behavioral enactment of greed at the top. Hence, my segue into greed as a major planet problem on planet Earth in our lifetime. So, social inequality research. Any of you have any connection to epidemiology, broad-based international comparative studies on health of people around the globe, you would know there's a big enterprise now on what's called social inequalities in health, which is essentially documenting gradients in all kinds of indicators of health as a function of where you sit in the socioeconomic hierarchy, measured typically by educational status, income, or occupational status. That literature, to which I have contributed and which I think is really important and is telling very compelling stories about how bad life is if you are disadvantaged. And I'm not talking about just living in abject poverty. Life is bad even if you're middle class, even if you're middle class in America, because the middle class is losing ground. That research, in my view, is strangely, curiously preoccupied with telling tales about the disadvantaged. And almost no one talks about life at the top. No one talks about greed at the top. So I'm here to talk about greed, not as a moral problem, which it is, but I want to talk about greed as a new direction in science. And I want to give you a flavor for what I mean by that. A first point is this: greed is as timeless in the human experience as well-being. The ancient Greeks wrote about greed and injustice in classical Athens. They believed that greed should be publicly censured. But then we have Dante. Dante's 9 circles of hell in the Inferno included the crimes of gluttony and greed, fraud and dishonesty. And even Adam Smith, the father of self-interest and contemporary capitalism in capitalist societies around the globe, he wrote about the problem of greed. He said this vain and insatiable lot do not know the limits of their own appetites. So I have started puzzling about why do we not talk about the problem of greed in contemporary science. And I first grappled with some of these issues in an article in the International Review of Economics, which I found an interesting literature about what motivates greed. Where is it coming from? The etiology of selfishness and worship of money. And then you can bring in very important social psychology, the dark side of the American dream, which basically documented ways in which extrinsically motivated pursuits like money have negative consequences for well-being relative to intrinsically motivated pursuits. But there is also incredibly interesting work going on now. Paul Piff is the author of several of these papers. He's documenting in both experimental studies and in correlational studies how upper class status translates to a sense of entitlement, narcissism, and even unethical behavior. This is the cover of a recent issue of the Atlantic Monthly. For those of you who don't know, American magazines, whatever, this is a kind of intellectual magazine in the sense that they publish very thoughtful review articles about contemporary issues. So here we have on the cover the birth of a new aristocracy in America. The gifted at the top, basically a baby with Yale on the t-shirt. And the question many of us are asking ourselves is what lies behind this growing acceptance of widening inequalities in the US? We have not only returned to the Gilded Age, and if that's not a phrase that's meaningful to some of you, the Gilded Age happened around the 1880s, 1890s, 1900 in the US. It was captured powerfully in the literature of writers like Edith Wharton and Henry James. They wrote about this period of enormous discrepancies in wealth in the US. We are not only back at the Gilded Age, we are worse than the Gilded Age in degrees of discrepancies between the haves and the have-nots. And what we are learning, because good science is happening about this, is that part of the explanation for it comes from the socialization for affluence that is happening at elite educational institutions in the US. And the background of this is the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu first developed some of these ideas in 1977, has carried them forward, but the crux of his thesis is that elite schools are the central mechanisms that perpetuate class hierarchies, class inequality, which is so contrary to the American dream. It's so contrary to the American mythology that education is there for all, and education is going to give you the way to basically enact your own dream. So let me tell you about this amazing science that was just published in 2016 by some political scientists at Princeton. They first remind us that back in the 1940s, there was really thoughtful research being done about what happens to young people when they go up to college or university. They have a kind of a re-socialization. It's a socialization experience. And at that time, the evidence suggested that college had a kind of liberalizing effect on affluent students from conservative families. That is now changing in America. What we now see is evidence of socialization of norms for financial gain among the affluent. And this is based on about 65,000 students from 360 universities. It's data from the Higher Educational Research Institute. And they have one dependent variable in this study. This is really rigorously done work where they have 1 billion controls for every possible alternative explanation for the data. But the key dependent variable is how much do you agree or disagree with this statement? Wealthy people should pay a larger share of taxes than they do now. And the high point in this graph, if you can't see it, I'll tell you what the punchline is here. The highest point in degree of opposition to taxing the wealthy is that you are at an affluent university where more than 50% of the students come from affluent backgrounds, and you are a member of a sorority or a fraternity. So they are basically linking embeddedness in campus life as part of this mechanism for this socialization of financial gains. Similarly, they also graph, it's the same dependent variable, and they're basically showing that campus affluence also predicts a greater percentage. The high point in this graph is basically you're affluent and you want to make a lot of money. That predicts a higher likelihood that you are going to disagree with the view that the wealthy should pay more taxes. These problems are happening worldwide, and they are fueling topics that people in psychology, especially positive psychology, need to get with it on. We need to be paying a lot more attention to anger, which we are studying in MIDUS. It's one of the most interesting emotions in the human repertoire of emotions, in my view. This is an incredible book. I've never met this author, but let me tell you, I want to encourage everybody to read this book because it's dazzling in its scholarly depth, a kind of scholarship that I think is missing in a lot of contemporary science, theory, reflection about anything. So this author integrates history, philosophy, literature, politics, economics, and cultural studies. And he begins with this point. Individuals with very different paths find themselves herded by capitalism and technology into a common present where grossly unequal distributions of wealth and power have created humiliating new hierarchies. This proximity is rendered more claustrophobic by digital communications and the improved capacity for envious and resentful comparison. These are the pathways that fuel societal upheavals when societies get so out of whack in terms of degrees of inequality. Then comes the revolution, or you might say in contemporary America, then comes this unbelievable tribalism that characterizes contemporary life in the US. Let me come back to science here. I mentioned in MIDUS, we have very good assessments of anger, anger expression, anger denial, anger repression. And this is a publication you can find on our website showing that if you are low educational status and you are angry, your biomarkers, your biological risk factors look even worse than if you are just low SES. Anger exacerbates the negative impact of low SES on biological risk factors. We also just have new findings from MIDUS documenting that mental health in America has declined among disadvantaged Americans in the post-recession era. Just published in the PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. The title is Declining Mental Health Among Disadvantaged Americans. So there's a comparison here between Americans before the Great Recession, Americans after the Great Recession. On these aspects of well-being, positive and negative affect, life satisfaction. Some of my measures are in there too. What we find is that the post-recession sample shows greater distress and less well-being than the pre-recession sample among those who were already disadvantaged. And I put deaths of despair here because this article, some of you may have heard about a high visibility publication in the US by Case and Deaton, also published in the PNAS, showing higher rates of death than we've ever seen before among middle-aged white Americans. Unheard of in the history of studies of mortality. Those deaths are called deaths of despair in some instances because they are tangled up with the opioid epidemic in the US. These are deaths about lives that are not going well. And this study just basically fills in some of the mental health background. So my point here is we need new science to document the impact of greed at the top on the well-being of those below. These are tractable questions. I talk about economists who do research in entrepreneurial studies. There are ways in which you can empirically evaluate the distribution of corporate profits and look at the well-being of all those in the hierarchy in the workplace relative to those at the top. This, to me, can become a venue in which scientific research is a way of censoring greed at the top. Okay, so now I put on my sky blue tint and I shift to something else because I can't live in that incredibly negative place all the time, but it concerns me a great deal. At the same time, I feel compelled to talk about what I think are incredibly powerful and potentially neglected topics that are forces for eudaimonia. So this is my shift to the role of the arts and the humanities in promoting eudaimonia. The first question is, why do we even need the arts and humanities? Or do we need the arts and humanities? Lots of smart, thoughtful people have written about this. Martha Nussbaum's book, Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. She says, among other things, we need the humanities to create competent and compassionate citizens. Helen Small's book elaborates many reasons of underscoring the value of the humanities, including illuminating the meaning-making practices of culture. But I want to dig into some readings that have really, I don't know, distilled for me some of the main messages here. Mark Edmondson is a professor of English literature at the University of Virginia, and he has many wonderful books. This is one of them. Why read? Why read great literature is really what he's answering here, or asking here. He believes college students need to read great literature because it nurtures their own vitality. It nurtures their own vitality. So he quotes from William Carlos Williams, "Yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found in despised poems." He quotes William Blake, "All deities ultimately reside in the individual human heart." Just to give you a flavor of some of the cool stuff that's in this book, Why Read, he goes into an exegesis about Wordsworth's poem, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. At the time, Wordsworth was living in a din-filled city among unfeeling people. He sensed he was becoming one of them. There was a dull ache in his heart. He returned to this beautiful place of his youth, and that became the poem. And this is Edmondson's quote, "Wordsworth's poem enjoins us to feel that the answer to our despondency lies somewhere within our reach. We are creatures who have the capacity to make ourselves sick, but also the power to heal ourselves." And I would just note, if you've never read John Stuart Mill's autobiography, get it and read it. It's a spectacular book of remarkable honesty. in which he basically describes the crisis in his own mental history. This is a guy whose father was teaching him Greek and Latin and mathematics when he was 4 and 5 years old. And he gets to early adulthood and he's in the middle of all of this utilitarian philosophy, which is really about promoting the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. And he realizes he doesn't have it. He's not happy. He was basically, I think, dealing with depression and poetry, in particular, Wordsworth's poetry, and falling in love with someone really helped John Stuart Mill. Just this brief note, there are problems even with how the humanities are taught in many of our academies. Many educators in the humanities shy away from teaching literature to nurture inner vitality. More prized is critical thinking, and the key example here would be someone like Derrida, who clears away with but offers nothing in return. So the humanities, in Edmondson's view, teach dissociation of intellect from feeling. Here he quotes Friedrich Schiller, who wrote about sublime pathos, also wrote, "A true education ought to fuse heart and mind." And Goethe's wonderful quote, "It's easy to be brilliant if you don't believe in anything." So this points to new questions for science, in my view. There is actually now a whole new field called health humanities. And we are going after some of these, I'm hoping to go after some of these things in the MIDUS study. Essentially digging into how do the arts and humanities nurture our well-being and thereby possibly promote our health. So this Venn diagram is a look at all of the disciplines that are integrated in MIDUS. So the psychosocial factors represent all kinds of subfields of psychology and human development, whatever. Then we have the population disciplines, the socio-demographic factors, many disciplines there, and then the neurobiological factors fill in a lot. The next question is this: what's missing in MIDUS? A lot. We know tons about people's stress in work and family life. But we know actually quite a lot about their emotions and their well-being. We don't know anything about their encounters with the arts, the visual arts, music, literature, poetry, dance, film, theater, nature. And I would just note that this really important big report came out from the Royal Society for Public Health in the UK in 2013 on this theme of art, health, and well-being. If we get serious about this, we need to go back and we need to read great literature. I mean, this isn't fiction. This is John Dewey. John Dewey had so many incredible thoughts about education, but he also wrote this book on art as experience. How do we experience art? How do we take it in? How do we understand the meaning of artistic products? And he was not oblivious to the fact that art can be in many ways tangled up with capitalism and imperialism and nationalism. But I just want to draw attention to, I don't know, for those of you from the UK, or Europeans, what you think of Alain de Botton. His School for Life, maybe some people think it's kind of crazy. I think the guy is actually really smart, really knowledgeable. He doesn't cite anybody. He doesn't play by any of the rules that we play by, but I think he gets most of it right. And he's written some spectacular books, and he has videos. He's got, I mean, there's a ton of stuff you can find online about his perspective, but this is just his reflections on art as therapy. Distilling what he thinks are the main functions of art, the 7 functions of art. And then, because he's so out there, he says, I think we could take these ideas and redesign museums. We could reorder how the art is actually assembled in the museum, which I think is really spectacular. Instead of organizing art by country or historical period or whatever, how about we have a gallery of self-knowledge, a gallery of love, a gallery of fear, compassion, and suffering. But this same guy, Alain de Botton, this book is not to be missed. I mean, there's so much humor but in his writings, but this is how Proust can change your life. As I have lived my life as an academic, I've always been ravenously reading literature. And I realized that the writers whose work I most resonate to are those who were just soaring neurotics. One of which would be Marcel Proust, another would be Franz Kafka, but these people who just became spectacular writers because they suffered so much. So this is a book that tells you how to love life today via insights from Proust, how to take your time, how to suffer successfully, express your emotions, open your eyes. And this is basically how to suffer successfully. This is Marcel Proust writing. Infirmity alone makes us take notice and learn and enables us to analyze processes which we would otherwise we would know nothing about. A man who falls straight into bed every night and ceases to live until the moment he wakes and rises will surely never dream of making not necessarily great discoveries, but even minor observations about sleep. He scarcely knows that he is asleep. A little insomnia is not without its value in making us appreciate sleep, in throwing a ray of light upon that darkness. We suffer, therefore we think. How to open our eyes. Great painters possess such powers to open our eyes because of the unusual receptivity of their own eyes to aspects of visual experience, the play of light on the end of a spoon, the fibrous softness of a tablecloth, the velvety skin of a peach, or the pinkish tones of an old man's skin. Qualities that can in turn inspire our impressions of beauty. This is about the happiness that comes from taking a second look. Our dissatisfactions may be the result of failing to look properly at our lives rather than the result of anything inherently deficient about them. I also believe that the arts can be powerful venues for nurturing compassion and insight vis-a-vis social inequality. And I'll just give you some examples from contemporary film. This recent film in the US called The Florida Project is a film about down and out families in a Florida motel, financially desperate mothers and their adventurous children. William Dafoe serves as the compassionate manager in the film. Another recent film in the US called American Honey is about disadvantaged youth growing up with addicted parents. They escape to a cross-country road trip that is actually about a selling scam. They're basically being exploited. But you get to know these young people on this cross-country trip that has beautiful imagery of the changing landscape and a lot of great music in it. But the core theme is basically about youthful aspirations vis-a-vis a cruel and ungiving world. And this is such a spectacular film. Has anybody seen this? Paterson. Oh, don't miss it. Paterson is a city in New Jersey. It's a working class city in New Jersey. And this is about a bus driver in Paterson who also is named Paterson. And Paterson is also the city where William Carlos Williams lived. He was a physician providing care to working class people in Paterson, New Jersey, while he was writing all of his great poetry. So it's a touching, beautiful, delicately wrought film with magnificent humor and a main message, both for Paterson, the bus driver, who's eavesdropping on people on the bus. He's eavesdropping on their conversations, and then he writes great poetry about what they're talking about. And his partner is as an artist in a million different ways. They're just humble working class people who are full of artistic creativity. In the background here, you see Passaic Falls, which is part of Paterson, New Jersey, and William Carlos Williams wrote a lot of poetry about the falls. Another example of contemporary fiction, not film, this book recently out, spectacular. I don't know, we read about the refugee problem, we see it on the news all the time. There is nothing like great fiction to take you into what does it feel like to be one of those people every day. So this is, I think, a way to ignite needed empathy. And this last example of contemporary fiction, we heard in the spectacular presentation by Robert Niemeyer. There was so much, I loved his presentation, particularly underscoring the importance of the imagination in activating ways in which people can deal with not only grief, but race relations and contemporary challenges. This is just basically saying fiction can do incredible things. This new book by Angie Thomas, it's called The Hate You Give, the acronym of which is THUG, which is a tattoo on the body of the rapper Tupac. And it's an amazing tale about how Black teenagers and their parents deal with the innocent killing of Black youth. So my last slides are where, even in my own head, I feel a need to kind of like not be so all over the map. So it's about, I think, examples of sometimes there are in human history periods in which we see a confluence of the forces both against and for eudaimonia. This is about art during turbulent times of societal change. Revolution, art that is tangled up with vast inequalities, but is actually also a response at the level of meaning making from the artist to what is going on. And so here I must go to Russia. This is an article that was in the New York Times in 2017 commemorating the Russian Revolution. And it was basically a review of a new exhibit at the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow, which, thanks to Dmitry's organization of the positive psychology meetings in Moscow in 2012, I had the great privilege to see the incredible art in that gallery. In this article, they are basically making the point that in 1917, for Russian artists, it wasn't about the revolution, it was about their art. And this was a quote from the article: "In a nation in which rulers have long written history to meet their needs, cleaning the art of 1917 as a century's worth of ideological claptrap has proved a most appropriate way to commemorate a revolution." Included in this article was this painting by Kandinsky titled "Troubled." My next slide is about Marc Chagall's life and biography. And in reading Marc Chagall's life, I learned for the first time that while Kandinsky and his wife were living in Moscow in the years immediately after the revolution, they had a child die of malnourishment. I mean, this is suffering on an incredible scale that is translated to art. And for those of you who like reading biography, this is a phenomenal biography. Marc Chagall has kind of been caricatured, I think, in so many ways in the US. You know, he's the Fiddler on the Roof artist. You need to know so much more about his life. This is his village of Vitebsk, where he started creating his artistic vision and imagery. This is about painting the lives of poor, humble Jews in Russia in a time in which there was a lot of anti-Semitism. And I can't help but bring up here Joseph Brodsky, who became a Nobel Prize winner in literature. His poetry is kind of too complex for me, but this book of essays is spectacular. Joseph Brodsky grew up living in starvation in St. Petersburg during the blockade of the city in 1941 to 43, and later he was sent to the Gulag for his parasitism. Anna Akhmatova believes that's where his soul as a poet was formed. That was the basis for his subsequent poetry. And what I put here may seem kind of weird, but my favorite essay in this book is the essay about the address he provided to the commencement crowd at Williams College in 1984. So think about commencement. We all imagine commencement is this day of hope and aspiration and celebration and future lives. And he talked about evil. He talked about evil on the day of commencement, which I think was audacious and probably one hopes, a very important message to those who heard him. All of these artists left Russia, but there were still other artists who remained in Russia. And there were many others who left in music and all kinds of, Russian culture is just so incredibly rich. But after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the TASS, Russian news agency, conscripted a lot of artists and writers to produce posters to reassure and rouse the Soviet citizenry. And there was a whole exhibit with a big, thick book that I bought at the Art Institute in Chicago about this years ago. And this art is so interesting in terms of what's in the art, but the point I'm making here is that the creativity among these artists flourished as they attempted to find purpose while working in and for a totalitarian state. So this is my finale. I've crowded way too much into this talk. Your heads may be spinning. Perhaps a better title for my talk would have been on being all over the place. But I give myself license to be all over the place because I think it's needed. These are things I think that we need to somehow embrace and get our heads and our arms around. So my key points are these. We have made great strides elevating the fundamental importance of meaning-making, self-realization, and personal growth in what it means to be human. That we celebrate and nurture those capacities does not obviate the need to address major societal problems. And I'm shining the spotlight on greed at the top as a force in contemporary societies that is obstructing the human potential of many of those below. But I'm also trying to underscore that the arts, broadly defined, nourish human well-being in profound ways, in both good times and bad, and that we need more science that gives prominence to the arts in the research that we do and the practice that we implement. I think maybe the take-home message is we need an even bigger tent. Thank you.